everybody, and welcome to another live stream from a Wicked Parley. I'm your co-host Rose, and this is Justin.
Hi, everybody. Tonight we have a great episode for you. We're going to be talking about ignorance and how much does it play a role. But before we get into that particular topic, I want to kind of mention a couple interesting things that are going to be happening on Saturday's episode. So normally we kind of keep the episode kind of a little bit of a secret, but with it, it's going to be kind of a special one. We're going to be talking about delayed gratification, and we're also going to be having an experiment where you, the viewer, will have an opportunity to be able to participate. So that could be a lot of fun. And all you need in order to participate is to have a snack with you, a snack that you have not eaten. And that's it. That's all you need. So it can be anything: crackers, chips, cookies, preferably not ice cream.
Darn it.
No ice cream. I mean, I guess it could be ice cream, but it might be melted. So if that's something you like, then perhaps that might be okay.
Good to know. Alright, so anything else?
Yes. We're going to be having a secret challenge at the end of the episode.
Ooh.
And so, if you guys want to know about the secret challenge at the end of the episode, then make sure to stay tuned and watch the very end of the episode.
Yes.
And with that out of the way, what are the topics we'll be covering today?
Bam! So, as everybody knows, today we're talking about ignorance, as seen by the title of the live stream. But for those of you who don't have the time or need to catch up with us later, these are the topics for today.
And also note that there will be a chapter system in place, so that way, in case you guys want to skip past something later, you know, if you're watching this in the future, you'll be able to kind of click on the exact thing you want to watch, and then it'll be there. Or if you don't have time to watch the full episode, you'll know kind of where to find the continuing part, in case you guys gotta leave early.
Yep. We all have lives. That's important.
Yes, we all have lives. We get busy.
Yes.
Exactly.
Alright, so first thing is first.
First thing is first?
Yes, first thing is first. No, first thing is last.
Of course, it's gotta be last.
That's the way it is. What are you talking about? Anyway, what do you define as ignorance?
Okay, well, ignorance obviously has many possible definitions. I love this image. There are so many different ways in which you can define it, but I think the easiest way to probably get at it is it's a lack of knowledge or awareness of a specific set of circumstances or situations. You know, it's simply not having the ability to do something or function or be aware of a certain terminology, both, you know, linguistically or culturally, in a certain situation.
Mm-hmm. So that's more the general definition.
Yeah.
One you could probably find in a dictionary, or what a lot of people would consider a definition.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
Yeah. What about the different types and levels of ignorance? Because I've heard of a few, such as blissful ignorance, circumstantial ignorance. I've heard of a couple of others that I can't remember off the top of my head. But what do you think about those, quote, different levels of ignorance, unquote?
Well, I'm not sure I would necessarily call them levels. I would say they're more like different states of being ignorant, right?
Mm-hmm.
So blissful ignorance, you know, probably could be summed up by someone whom is happily unaware of something very specific. Perhaps there's something going on that that benefits them, or they're just, you know, they're happy and they just don't know something. Malevolent ignorance, which is one of the ones that we didn't really mention, but it's there, is when someone does something intentional that makes them unaware of something and it creates harm directly to another individual because of their lack of awareness. I mean, you could think of like a politician writing in certain bills that favors some of their constituents, but maybe it comes at the cost of like some, let's say, Native American land or something like that. Certain pipeline comes to mind when I think about something like that. Then there's also circumstantial evidence. Ignorance. Circumstantial ignorance is kind of like it's not necessarily directed at any one particular thing, good or bad. It's kind of like it could kind of be either, or could kind of be any. And so those are the kind of situations that I think most people find themselves in. This could often take place academically. Perhaps they're they raise their hand thinking they know the answer to some particular question, and instead they don't know the question, and so maybe a class makes fun of them, or they feel a little embarrassed or something like that. And I think that's one way in which ignorance can kind of unfold in a random set of ways, which is kind of the way I think of when it comes to circumstantial ignorance.
Fair. So we can kind of agree that, I'm pretty sure, I think we agree, that each type of ignorance, no matter what it be, the three we listed, plus a bunch more, each of type of them is harmful in some way, shape, or form. Just depends on how quickly it decides to kick your keister. Some of them is a lot quicker than others.
I definitely would agree with that. I definitely think that there's definitely harm involved in ignorance in some level. Now, could that harm be, oh my God, it's going to be life-shaking, or could it be just subtly something small? Probably. I mean, there's an example of someone that I know whom, is kind of like a health nut, right?
Yeah.
And they're in a relationship, and when they started this particular health journey, they were like, I'm not going to have any more sugar anymore. And so this person decided, hey, I'm not going to have sugar in my coffee anymore. And after a couple of days of this, he wasn't exactly in his best mood, we'll say. And his partner saw this and was like, hey, what can I do to help? And the decision that was ultimately decided was that I'm not going to say a damn thing, but I'm going to add a little bit of sugar to his coffee. So that way it tastes a little bit better, and maybe that will be enough to make him not so upset. And it kind of worked, because it wasn't really upset anymore. And he was completely unaware. I mean, I don't know how you can be unaware of something that's sweet added to your coffee, because you should be like, oh, I know that right away. But
it depends on the levels.
2 and 2 never went together. But it worked.
I mean, it worked, and it's not as moody, so I guess that's a win?
Yeah, it's kind of a win. And I think there's also, some examples, of some circumstantial events that I think I could kind of speak to personally. And that is simply, I'll meet somebody, and I'll talk to them, and I'll get familiar with them, and I'll get comfortable kind of with certain things, and I'll kind of assume that they're coming from me from the same perspective. And then there'll be some detail about them that I'm completely unaware of, I'm completely ignorant to. And it creates a bit of unshaky ground, we'll say. And that's a way in which it kind of can bite me in the butt, and so I think, there's that. And I think malevolent ignorance, if we're going to talk about any examples regarding that, I think that's kind of obvious. But just for the sake of anything, I would say that an example of malevolent ignorance in which any person might perhaps run into has to do with the fact that when you gas up your car that it has a harmful effect to the environment, but you are completely ignorant of the actual impact that has on your life, because you don't see the whole world. You see your little corner of it. And so that could be a way in which you're going to be malevolently ignorant to something, and at the same time also be blissfully ignorant to something. And if you, depending upon the circumstance, you could also say it's circumstantial ignorance. So it's kind of like all three.
Oh no. It's a triple whammy. God. That was not supposed to be cheery, but I made it anyway because it's just upsetting.
I know, right?
I don't want to think about it because it's necessary to drive for me. Anyway, there's way more instances that we could probably go through and take up the entirety of the episode. No doubt about that.
Very much could potentially be an entire tangent. I mean, if we just keep on talking.
Granted, that could make an interesting episode if you just went on tangents constantly, see what you come up with during a tangent, that one game I told you about.
No. We're not going to play that game. But here's the other thing too. I don't think our audience wants to see that.
Who knows? Anyway. So, how about this instead of going on the tangent here? Why do these types of situations occur? Is it more environmental, personal, and if it depends, what might it depend on?
Okay, well, let's kind of tackle a couple of things first. First to define what is exactly would be an environmental situation that would create this type of discussion in the first place. How does ignorance tie in environmentally? Well, first thing to consider is that there are vast portions of the world that don't have the ability to have what you might consider upward mobility. right?
Hmm.
You can't do something in your community to escape it. Um, so you were kind of stuck there. So you might just kind of be unable to leave your general area, and that limits the amount of exposure you might have. And because of that particular kind of exposure, it limits your overall options. And because of that, when you are confronted with something that is completely outside your purview of knowledge, you just simply are unaware of what people are doing and saying that correspond to that particular bit of knowledge. And so that might be one way in which it can be created. The other, which is I think also equally common, it has to do with religious ideology. There's very much an ingrained kind of perspective, communally in some religions, that this is the way you conduct yourselves, and people who are not like this are bad, or etc. Right? And so when a person is deemed bad or not a part of the in group, they're ostracized, they're not considered. And so the people who are part of that in group are only considering the people who are in their immediate vicinity, not other people. And so they become closed-minded to the viewpoints and values of others. And I think that's really one of the other strong examples of how this kind of thing can happen environmentally.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to perhaps a few other things, you might want to consider the fact that some people tend to have this perspective of, I'm right, you're wrong.
I've met a couple.
Huh?
I've met a couple of them.
Yes. If you have gotten to a particular perspective where I'm right and you're wrong, and they're challenged, then they dig their heels into the ground. You know, they kind of, act in a certain way. And we'll kind of touch on that in a little bit. But all of those things kind of coalesce together to create this various perspective of how a person kind of upholds it. And so when you get exposure to that, both from your community, directly from your immediate surroundings, and perhaps you don't have a lot of excess knowledge, then it continues to kind of unfold in a negative way. Now, one of the things that I think often happens is this idea of the burden of performance. Okay, and that is, if you're a influencer, or let's say you're somebody of standing in your community, then one of the things that you could really get kind of in trouble with is that you could say something, and because of your position, you have to take a specific stand, and then you're thrown into kind of like a series of arguments that you didn't even intend on, and more often than not, the people in those arguments don't even know what they're really even trying to say in the first place. And so you get into this whole ideological fight that's all built on people not understanding each other and not being able to relate to one another. And that's based upon, similar to what I mentioned before about, exposure versus not exposure.
Fair. I know sometimes I've been thrown into arguments where either I had no clue about what was being said, and anytime I tried to get out, wouldn't let me go without choosing a side because they wanted me to pick their side, and I'm like, that's annoying.
I would imagine so.
He's just like, I don't want to say you're right because I don't know if you are right, but you're not going to let me go, now are you? Ugh.
I mean, some people who get those particular things probably suppress their emotions. Sometimes they might have repressive thoughts that kind of dictate this particular mentality and probably are causing you to drag yourself into those arguments, and they're trying to prove their position correct, and so they're using you to state their ideology when more often than not they're probably ignorant of other things that are creating the feuding in the first place.
Fair. I've also seen a couple of arguments where people would just huff, kind of groan, and turn around and walk away as if nothing happened, kind of ignoring the argument and the lack of actual ending for it. I'm thinking that for some people it might be like an attempt to kind of stay in their comfort zone, at least for the one leaving. What are some of the other reasons that people might just kind of turn around and keep being ignorant?
Well, first of all, I'd like you to kind of define what you mean specifically by comfort zone.
Sure, especially since the way I'm using it right now is probably way different than the usual definition. So when I say comfort zone here, it's kind of the zone or bubble that people want to stay in because it's their particular view or perspective that they have, and it's more comfortable for them to stay in that little bubble, even if it might not be the best overall.
Hmm.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's kind of falls in line with kind of like my particular ideology when it comes to this.
Uh-huh.
I always kind of view everybody as kind of like in a bubble, right?
Oh, okay.
They are
Bubbles.
surrounded by a bubble. And I think that more often than not, people who are open, right, they
Yeah.
come along and they find people who kind of match their bubble and they kind of stick together, become a bigger network of bubbles, right?
Hmm.
And then there's those people who basically are like, I am ignorant of everything. I'm pushing everything away. And those people pop their bubble. And now they're outside the bubble. And they have nowhere to connect. And so rather than trying to form a new bubble and be able to kind of pick themselves up and continue on, they want to point the finger at every single other person who is inside a bubble and blame them. And it's because they're not willing to accept the ideology of another person who is inside the bubble.
Okay, that unfortunately makes more sense than I'd like to admit.
Perhaps. But to your question, though,
Yeah.
to the particular question itself, I think some of the reasons why people might find themselves in a comfort zone when it comes to those kind of circumstances is that I think it's a common thing, right? Typically, people don't surround themselves with people who challenge them all the time. What happens is that you get this kind of clique-like behavior, and it happens very often early in childhood and just kind of continues on throughout your life, where you find people who kind of have similar values and similar ideologies to yourself that reinforce your particular position, reinforce your thoughts on that particular subject, and then they agree with you. And so you get surrounded by what I call yes people. You don't want yes people in your person all the time. You want there to be kind of like a balance of a little bit of everything. Because if you have no one to challenge you, then when you step out of line, there's no one to correct you, which means that you could have a catastrophic effect. You could be a total asshole on the internet. I know, because I am that asshole sometimes. But I have a good friend group that kind of reels me in and goes, no, such as you. And a few other people that I could name that I trust. So it's important, to have these things. And so before we get on to the next thing, I noticed that in the chat there was a couple comments. Do you want to touch on those at all?
Let's see. At the moment, they're talking about the health kick in the coffee.
Yes.
And unfortunately, some of them have also been in the same situation where they're thrown into arguments and forced to choose a side rather than, get the heck out because they don't want to.
Yes. I think that happens to a lot of people. And I think that
Fortunately.
it probably stems from the fact that the people whom experience that are probably becoming aware and they're not as ignorant as the people who are engaging that particular behavior. Because of that, they're like, oh God, I don't want to be part of this anymore. I don't want to be involved in this. I just want to be like, move on. And it's kind of like being like, I'm aware of this.
Yeah.
I think that's probably what it's tied to. So.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
So, those were more on a personal note. Let's go global.
Oh boy. Global.
Global. So, obviously, cultures are different. That's just kind of a fact. Which means interactions between those of different cultures are also going to be different. So many uses of the word different.
Yeah.
So, in your opinion, what are some of the inherent dangers of remaining ignorant in any of these interactions?
Okay. Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge when it comes to the global understanding of the world is that every culture is inherently going to be different. But because we're all on the globe, we're all on the world, we all are interdependent on one another. Whether it be for trade, the distribution of resources, whether it be, woods, metals, waters, medicine, like a certain pandemic, you know what I'm saying? We're interdependent upon one another. And so when you're ignorant of the needs and the viewpoints of other people around the world, you're doing is you're not only are you hurting them, but you're hurting yourself. You're hurting the reputation of any person who is from your particular country who is trying to go out into the world. Because who knows what the implications are if, let's say, I don't know, a country goes, hey, we have this horrible pandemic-like effect going on, and now because of this, we're going to have other countries close their borders. People get stuck. Not saying it hasn't happened before, you know what I'm saying?
We know exactly what you're talking about.
But there's a ton of possible situations that kind of go on when it comes to these kind of things. I mean, when it comes to like governments or countries performing humanitarian efforts, you know, maybe providing food, shelter, you know, water, medicine to poorer countries, or maybe like a country that just experienced a natural disaster. You know, if you don't understand the culture, and which means you won't have a chance at understanding the needs of that group, and so it can create disastrous consequences. There's an example that I could speak about that happened in the early 90s. This is something that was tied to a book that I had read a couple months ago that was discussing diagnoses and mental disorders kind of like throughout the world. And there was this chapter that was discussing the impact of bulimia on China, and kind of like seeing how, and back then, bulimia, the symptoms that were kind of portrayed were not the same symptoms that were commonly shared in the West. But then a famous person claimed to have this particular thing, and I'm not going to say they didn't or they did, but this happened. And then suddenly, a bunch of people who wouldn't normally have been, who would have been given this diagnosis, now got this diagnosis. And it was because the people who were in charge of the medical information in the West did not adequately understand and vet people from China and from, you know, the East, and to understand really how their culture was different, and instead force this entire like doctrine, which potentially could have damaged and harmed literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And so it's important that when you act on a global stage, you do the due diligence of understanding the culture, understanding the needs of the individuals, and being open-minded, and don't assume that your position is the correct one.
Yeah, that sounds terrible and horrible. I'd hate to be misdiagnosed because some other area happened to have those symptoms, and just because I happen to have them as well.
I mean, there's a story
Yeah.
that I heard about. I was in a class, biology class, several years ago, and one of the professors had a great story about that had to pertain to something like this. A person was traveling to the Arctic to collect some samples, and while the person was there, they came across an individual like that was part of like an Inuit kind of like community. And while the person was there, befriended the locals, understood them, treated them with respect, and he was treated pretty well. He did his work, he collected his samples, he came back home. Well, his efforts were taken to such a successful particular position that they decided to send another person out that particular way to do more or less the same thing. They were just trying to gather more samples, and the guy was disrespectful.
No.
He did not do anything. He was inconsiderate of the people, and he just was this horrible person. And when he left, there was no mention of this particular behavior. So the guy who originally collected the samples was asked to return back there to collect more samples to verify some of the findings that they had been making. And when he arrived, he was attacked by the local groups, assuming that he basically was just like the previous guy who was disrespectful and all sorts of things like this. And I mean, there was an instance where he could have been killed because of this particular behavior, because the guy who was there before him didn't understand that you have to treat people with respect, and you have to be courteous of other individuals. And because of this, this guy, had a really terrible situation, and luckily was able to work things out and start to have a more positive relationship with them. And so he was allowed to leave safely. But that area very much has been looked at as, oh, this is not good, because of the actions of one guy who didn't take into consideration the cultural impact of his actions. And so ignorance really plays a huge role when it comes to explaining that particular thing. Because if not, then that's just freaking evil.
Jeez. Even before we get into the next bit, holy crap, that's a real story?
Yeah, it's a real story.
Shh.
Yeah, I know, right?
That just makes me mad.
Yeah.
Like, if I met that guy, I'd want to punt him into the goddamn sun.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's a legit disaster in the making if the guy who made the return couldn't calm them down. Like, he would have been killed for something he didn't even do.
Yeah.
For the love of fudge. What do you think would have happened if people were less ignorant when it came to world issues or information or those sorts of things?
Well, I think that the world wouldn't be that much different than it already currently is. I think that the world itself is complex, and I don't think we're gonna you can go, okay, if everyone was understanding, everyone's singing Kumbaya, we're all gonna be happy, the world's gonna be at peace. No. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that there are still gonna be problems, there's still gonna be fighting, there's still gonna be wars, there's still gonna be health problems, and there's still gonna be natural disasters. I think what's more likely to happen is that if you have an understanding of the culture, if you are having an open perspective and you're just trying to actually do a positive thing, then you're very likely going to just be able to respond quicker. You're going to be able to deal with the problem with less people being harmed by it. That's the thing I kind of expect. There's a story.
Story? Story time.
Story time. There's another story that I could say that goes back, and I forgot exactly where I heard the story. But it talks about a couple who kind of didn't do this and didn't understand some of the cultural values of individuals, and I think they took local customs for granted. So let me explain this couple. This couple was, fairly well-to-do. The husband kind of, worked in Wall Street, and the wife kind of was I think she was a teacher. I want to say is what her profession was. And after their honeymoon, they decided to take like a year-long trip around the world.
Okay.
And they got this boat, and they started sailing around the Pacific. And they were traveling through a bunch of different islands in Indonesia, and there's like the Philippines and things like that. And they came across a series of islands that were really fascinating. There was a lot of interesting wildlife. The guy was an avid fisherman, and so they had spent a couple months kind of going around and getting familiar with a little bit of the people, which you think would be like, okay, cool, but they were looking at it from their perspective, not from the people's perspective. And so they, after fishing in the local spots, they decide that they're going to be going to another place, but beforehand they go to this other island, and they come across this guy who says, there's this island that's just this way, it's on your way out, that has a great fishing spot, you should go check it out. And the couple, after we've spoken to many of the locals and things like that, seemed to think, oh yeah, this is fine. And so they decided to pack up their stuff, and then the following day they sailed to the direction of that particular island. When they arrive, it's kind of like, oh hey, this is pretty normal. It's a nice place. It's pretty good. We'll set up a little bit of a camp here. We have the boat right over here. We'll kind of stay for the night, and then in the morning we'll go fish, and then we'll leave. Well, as they're setting things up, they see a guy come up off in the distance, and they're like, that's weird, because the island was supposed to be either uninhabited or very, very few people. And so the husband goes up to the guy and basically asks who you are and that sort of stuff. Finds out he's a local, and offers the guy, some sort of like trade, so that he'd be their guide, and so that way he could find the good fishing spots really quickly rather than having to figure it out. And the person agrees to be the guide. Well, the guy and the guide get just to talking, and they're like, okay, there's a spot where you can kind of overlook the exact location of where the spot is if you just follow me on this trail. And so he basically tells his wife, hey, stay here, make sure the boat's good, make sure the campsite's good, and I'll be back in a couple hours. So a couple hours go by, guy doesn't return. And
oh no.
Yeah, I know, right? And she starts to worry a little bit. And so she's like, you know what? I'm gonna get things dinner ready, and then if it's not back, I'm gonna call the radio that's on the boat to try and get a hold of him. Well, she does, and still not back. And so she goes to the boat, gets the radio, tries to contact him, nothing. So she thinks that, well, there's the chance that they're on the other side of the island for some reason, and there's some sort of reason why it does not work. They don't know, but she's like, okay. Now it's almost dusk, and he's still not back. But the guide comes back, and is kind of rushing over to her, and is saying something to the effect of, your husband's in trouble or something like that. Well, she turns, grabs like a bag, and immediately feels like she's been hit in the back of her head. Goes black.
That can't be good.
No. What appears to probably be a couple hours later, she awakes. It's dark, right? But she's tied with her arms behind her back to a post, surrounded by jungle, and in the distance she kind of hears the crashing of waves hitting rocks. And so you're like, okay, this is not good. So she sees the person that probably struck her, that was the guide, talking with somebody. She makes out that the somebody that the guy's talking to is the local who directed her husband to this island. And the flashing of the light starts to strike the ground near her, and she starts to see that there's a figure next to her, and that figure happens to be wearing clothes that are similar to her husband's, and in fact were her husband's clothes, but the figure had its head severed.
What?
Yeah, and it begins to dawn on her that her husband is dead. He had his head chopped off, and she panics, and she starts trying to rub the bindings from her back, off. Eventually, she gets them off, and she starts to try to struggle a little bit, and gets kind of out and wiggles her way out of the bindings, and starts trying to make a break for the water. The guys take notice, chase after her. She makes it all the way to the water and dips below the surface and tries to kick as far away as she can. She makes it eventually to the shore, and they're like looking, there's flashlights looking for her, and this is going on for hours, and she's not found. The sun starts to come up, the lights are gone, there's no evidence, she doesn't hear him anymore, and she tries to make it back to the boat. Well, she makes it back to the boat and immediately radios for help. At which point, the person who is contacting her, sends help immediately, and she has very quickly found out that the island that she's on is a forbidden island that is populated by cannibals, and that she had been tricked into. Her and her husband had been tricked into going to this place.
Oh,
where the locals had intended to steal all of their stuff and kill them, and very likely eat them. And that stems from being ignorant of just cultural values and from being able to read the cues from various people. So it's sometimes important to not be ignorant of the surroundings. That story kind of exemplifies that.
Well, that's just kind of terrifying.
Yes.
Okay, I kind of don't want to imagine what other scenarios like that can happen, so I kind of get. Let's just move away from that, shall we?
Okay.
That's gonna give me nightmares later, maybe.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. It was a good story because it gives an exact warning, but that's terrifying.
Yeah.
Anyway, so back into a more personal note, because I don't think I can handle more global stories like that. How does ignorance influence people's daily lives? Well, besides murder.
Okay. Well, as we kind of touched on before, ignorance kind of can stem from some environmental factors. Well, I think that one of the most important things that kind of influences their daily lives is the fact that a person's opportunities in life might be reduced based upon a lack of being able to relate to various people.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to, like, I always like to think of this as like, all right, so if you're ignorant of everything, then you're probably going to create problems by simply not being aware of how to react, how to say, how to do certain things in certain settings, and you're going to do this thing that, like, I always hate, and I always try to do the exact opposite, which is closing doors. I always think of closing doors as like a closing opportunity. So instead of having that job or that promotion or that living situation or that nice car, you are denying that because you're not willing to do the work that's necessary to communicate properly. And because of that, you're just going to limit how good of a quality of life you could possibly have.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's one aspect of it. I think another aspect that could be positive or negative, I guess, depending on the situation, but I think in my head it's more negative, is that it can impact your relationships very negatively. Well, some people who are ignorant of many things find relationships to be easy because if both people are ignorant, then there's less things to fight over. So I guess that's one way to look at things in a positive note.
Silver lining?
Silver lining, yes, I suppose. But I also think that it means that the types of relationships you're going to have are going to be less meaningful overall. Because if you aren't aware of the needs of a particular person that you're in a relationship with, whether it be a friendship, whether it be a family member, whether it be a significant other, everyone has wants, desires, and needs. And you need to understand them. And if you're ignorant of that particular fact, then you're going to create strife, feuding, fighting, and just a whole mess of problems. And so it's really valuable to make sure that you do that. I personally think that it also might affect the way in which you perceive an education. Let's say that you're a student who's extremely ignorant and you are intolerant of certain people from a certain demographic, whether it be some sort of gender, race, whatever, right? Religious preference, okay, whatever that might be. If you're listening to that person and you do not like that person, then the information they have, no matter how good it is, you're not going to pay attention to, and that could further either exasperate your ignorance or keep it relatively the same because you're not growing as an individual, because you're not allowing other people's ideology to broker the surface and add to your overall base of knowledge. So at least those are the points that I can think of. What do you think?
Fair. It's just, I definitely hate those types of arguments. Like, you should listen. They may not always be correct because, that's kind of subjective depending on the situation, but it's worthy to know so that you can determine whether or not it's actually or worth listening to. But if you don't listen to begin with, it's just, you're not gonna have anything to add or subtract. Kyle has a comment. I am reading these comments, by the way, so Kyle mentions, funny enough, in Buddhism, ignorance is seen as the cause of disease. I thought that was a metaphor before the pandemic. Ignorance can also blind people of their common humanity, causing people to look down on others, seeing them as lesser, which honestly annoys the actual crap out of me.
I mean, honestly, I think Buddhism is an interesting religion. I don't really know terribly too much about it, to be honest with you, but from what I do know and from what you've just said, I kind of feel like there's probably some truth to that, because I definitely think that, ignorance can breed disease in a plethora of ways, whether it be actually physical disease or just mental diseases. So, I mean, how many people have suffered because someone wasn't smart enough to recognize, if this person treats this way, I'm going to make this person feel bad. Like the boss who doesn't relate to the employee, who causes the employee to have anxiety or depression. It's like that happens probably a lot. And so there's a whole way of looking at this that I think is kind of interesting. And so while I'm not that particular faith, I can see value in those particular types of teachings. And I think that absolutely. I think, to the other comment, ignorance itself is a problem for humanity because it shows that some people are willing to sacrifice their humanity for a feeling of being comfortable rather than understanding that by being uncomfortable you are able to better express yourself and ultimately have a more fulfilling life. But because they don't want to have that little bit of uncomfortability for a little while, they're not willing to do the things necessary to have a better life. And so it's like, yeah, I mean, I agree with both your points, Kyle.
Speaking of being comfortable, I would imagine this plays a part in some arguments that people have with each other. Like, how often do you think that people are defending their points because they actually know what's going on and what they're saying versus arguing because it's the only thing they know?
Oh my gosh. That
I feel like I just stepped on a mine.
it's not like you stepped on a mine. It's just more like that could kind of go in a bunch of different directions.
Okay.
But if I was gonna say it kind of like simply, I would say that yeah, because I think that why does an argument exist in the first place, right?
Mm-hmm.
More often than not, it's a person says an opinion that another person doesn't agree with, or says something that another person doesn't agree with. All right, so the person who says or does the thing that the other person doesn't agree with probably is ignorant of the emotions of the other person, and because of the severity of the particular level of ignorance, it creates a situation where an explosive outburst is almost the only thing that's going to happen. It's almost like inevitable, and because the person who initiated didn't understand, the person who is hurt by it doesn't have any reason to care about the other person. And so it creates these two butting heads that either one has to get tired to stop or one has to be destroyed.
Oof.
And so I think that's like really kind of where it comes down to when it comes to those particular things. And while that could be an episode almost all on itself, to be completely honest. I could break down this entire thing point by point, but to be fair to the entirety of the episode, I'm going to kind of leave it there.
Okay, fair. It just sounds like a big take a step back, take a deep breath, and chill.
That's probably my best advice for someone who gets into that situation, especially if it stems from ignorance, because you just have to become, I mean, honestly, the antidote to ignorance obviously is knowledge, but if you don't have a readily available access of knowledge, I don't know, a smartphone, I mean, it could be available to you, but if it's not, I'd say try to become more self-conscious, you know what I'm saying? Like, at least be aware of what your role is in your interactions, and then act accordingly to whatever you believe to create the most positive setup, and then there you go.
Mm-hmm. Fair. Especially considering how ugly they can get, guy.
Yeah. I mean, definitely some things can go just completely off the rails.
Not
like
even
that.
just with the conversation at hand, is it, huh?
No.
It's gonna put a dent in your relationship, depending
on
how ugly they get.
I mean, especially depends on how long you've had that relationship, right? I mean, like, I'm sure some relationships that go on for years or decades, it's like they got all sorts of dirt on you. They know exactly how to press your buttons, and so it can completely ignorance can happen in just a split moment. I mean, you could just be like totally ignorant of another person's feelings at the time, even if you normally would, and that would be enough to spark a major conflict. So it's like,
Yeah. So you mentioned, taking a step back, taking a deep breath, chilling, and getting more information as a way to kind of start combating ignorance.
yeah.
So, because it's one thing to have a debate, because at least you can learn something from that sort of thing.
Sure.
It's another thing having a screaming match.
Yeah.
No, just because debates get loud doesn't mean they're automatically screaming matches.
Of course.
Sometimes the mic's just broken.
Or sometimes you're facing someone like Donald Trump.
No, bad. Bad.
What?
Just no on those sorts of things.
Okay.
So besides being more accepting and more willing to listen and do the research and all that,
Okay.
what are some other ways to try and combat ignorance?
Okay, well, I mean, I really can't get around this without saying this. I mean, information is the way in which you combat ignorance. You inform yourself, go research something. If you come across something you don't know or don't understand, there's this thing called the internet. There's this thing called books, libraries. Find any of them, and you're going to instantly be able to access a bunch of different forms of knowledge that's going to allow you to break out of this level of ignorance. But I think it's also pretty fair to also say that no matter how smart, no matter how informed you might be, there's always going to be something you're going to be ignorant of.
Mm-hmm.
I am no exception. Rose is no exception.
Heck nah.
Nobody out there is the exception to this. No one's perfect. We all have gaps in our knowledge.
No one's omniscient.
No. And so I think that it's, having the grace to be like, hey, I don't understand all these things. It's okay that I don't understand these things. And instead of becoming, let's say, combative with debates of things when you get hit with something you don't know, be like, okay, you got me. You know, I don't have anything meaningful to say to you to this. But tell you what, I'm going to learn your perspective, and we're going to have another one, and we'll talk about it in the future when I'm more informed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, why is that considered a weakness in society? I don't understand. Because I think that, like, that right there, it promotes a more meaningful conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think just knowledge, educate, and honestly, like I said before, you know, if you can't, for whatever reason, there's no internet, there's no library, there's no books, you know, Amazon doesn't reach you, which I'm going to start to say you live at the bottom of the ocean at this point. But, you know, let's say all these avenues are not available to you for whatever reason, okay?
Mm-hmm.
You can still look at yourself. You can still regulate the way in which you respond to circumstances. And as long as you do that, you're probably on the right track to combating ignorance in some level.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. It's never the best feeling when you get into arguments with friends or family, and it's just like nonstop screaming because one of them's being ignorant of something. I got a friend of mine who's constantly in arguments with their family. It's never a pretty picture.
I imagine not.
So when you're becoming more self-aware of who you are and what you stand for, being able to realize what you do and do not know and able to act accordingly, what do you think people should be mindful of when attempting to fix being ignorant, whether it's for themselves or even sometimes trying to potentially correct other people?
Well, okay, so I'm going to say this right now.
Okay.
If you have a problem with ignorance, maybe correcting other people probably isn't a good place to start.
Yeah.
All right, I'm just going to say that. I'm not saying everyone's bad. I'm just saying maybe that's not the place to start. I mean, okay.
Not always the way to start. No.
No. So what I would say probably is that, you know, get exposure. You know, try to become more open to other ideologies. You know, if you find yourself in a situation where I don't agree with maybe X, Y, and Z religion, learn about those religions. And maybe what you might find is that the things you disagree with, maybe you don't agree with them, but maybe there'll be reasons why. You'll have a clear argument for when someone goes, this is what I believe. And you're like, yeah, I appreciate your perspective, but, you know, I have to, you know, politely disagree with you on this particular thing, and here's why. Versus, it's terrible, believe me. You know, it's like, why is it terrible?
You're wrong because you're wrong.
Yeah, exactly. You're wrong because you're wrong. It's like
like, excuse me?
You're not creating a solid, defendable position to be like, I'm building from. Instead, you're tearing things down. And, you know, is that not like the epitome of ignorance at the end of the day?
Don't get me started on arguments where one party will start attacking the other person like personally because they don't have an actual defense.
Yeah. I mean, that happens way too much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the best possible situation when it comes to dealing with these things really is, you know, if you can, travel the world. If you can, read a book. If you can, expose yourself to as many different opinions as you possibly can. And when you're presented with something you disagree with, don't out of hand disregard it. Hear it out, really understand it, and then formulate an opinion. But don't, you know, denigrate someone. Don't attack someone's position, you know, just for the fun of it. Because you're not helping. You're not adding to something. You're detracting from something, and you don't want to be that person.
Nope.
So,
What up?
that pretty much covers the entire topic, doesn't it?
Yeah, and if people want to get more into it, again, email the show, contact us on our socials. We're going to hit them with some more information in the upcoming weeks here.
Yeah.
Working on some stuff behind the scenes to surprise you guys.
Oh yeah, it's going to be great.
Speaking of a surprise.
Yeah, speaking of surprises. So, you might have come across the beginning of the video and we're like, there's a challenge. Well, being me and being the fact that apparently Rose likes to torture me.
Excuse you.
Yeah, okay, excuse me, When you see this list, you'll understand. uh, we have decided to take a series of challenges that I will be taking, and sometimes Rose will be taking, that will be kind of challenges to see what the psychological effects are of certain things. And there's a list of certain challenges that are going to be presented. So you ready to share that list?
Yep.
Okay.
Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Dun, da, 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 bum.
Okay. So this list will be determined by, let's say, a random to some extent.
Yes.
I have myself a wheel. This wheel has a series of numbers corresponding to it. 1 through 12 will be what appears here. And then 13 through 24 will correspond to, 13 will be 1, and 24, of course, will be 12. Every month, at the end of each month, I will spin from this wheel. I will then do whatever the number lands on. And then I will be, at the end of the month, be kind of telling you what I think the psychological effects of these particular things are. Note, if anyone joins the Patreon, they can add to the particular list of the wheel. And if you happen to be the superstar tier, you get to choose 1 month's actual challenge directly.
Oh, gosh.
So, let's say it's an incentive to watch me suffer, on YouTube. But at the end of a month, I will give my psychological viewpoint on the benefits and we'll say harm that something like this might do. So, if you're eager to add suggestions to the list, then please feel free to, join Patreon. And like I said, tier 1, you can throw suggestions that will get added to the list, assuming that they are not illegal, they are not life-threatening, and will not cause me significant harm one way or another.
No. I need my host. I cannot do the show on my own. No.
You hear that? Rose needs me, so don't kill me. But with that said, we're going to go ahead and spin the wheel, and you guys will find out what one we actually get. Of course, that may or may not. Yeah, no. What do you think? Should they know now, or should they have to wait till Saturday to find out what it is?
We'll see.
Okay. So, with that, I think that covers pretty much everything. Is there anything more you want to cover?
No, just a reminder that we appreciate every single each and every one of you. I haven't been able to say my highs at the beginning, so thank you for joining host, Safi and Kyle, and everybody else who hasn't typed in the chat because I can't give you a personal shout out. Define significant harm. Goodness gracious.
If I get hurt, okay? That's what significant harm is. And also, I just want to point out make sure that if you guys want to participate in the experiment on Saturday, make sure to bring a snack. Okay?
Don't eat it. And if you want to make it harder for yourself or for the experiment, I'm personally going to grab a snack, which I guarantee I would eat like in 5 seconds flat on a normal basis.
I will have Oreos.
I'm thinking of granola bars and seaweed packets.
So good. Okay, with that, is there anything more?
Thank you for coming to the show, and we will bid you adieu soon.
Later, everybody.